In 1975, a vessel cuts through the gray swells of the Southern Ocean, nosing toward a speck of rock that human beings had abandoned more than 40 years earlier. It sits deep in the roaring Forties, far south of Tasmania, an isolated outcrop hammered by relentless gales and freezing Antarctic squalls. The shoreline belongs entirely to sea lions, penguins, and nesting seabirds. Not a soul lives here. The party coming ashore had every reason to expect a wasteland of bleached bone. Decades earlier, around 4,000 domestic sheep were simply left behind when the pastoral lease went bust. In any standard high country paddock or station country across the mainland, an unshorn sheep is a dead animal walking. A heavily fleeced breed abandoned to the elements gets buried alive beneath its own fleece, carrying half its body weight in matted wool, rendered blind, crippled, and completely helpless. By every rule of animal husbandry and biological survival, that entire flock should have perished before the 1930s were out. Yet as the landing party breaches the ridge, motion stirs along the skyline. Figures are picking their way through the maritime scrub, heading down toward the surge. But whatever is moving across that hillside, it no longer looks or behaves like any domestic stock those men had ever handled. These beasts possessed long, athletic legs, sharp vigilance, and a stride born for wilderness. To understand how that happened, you have to look at what this windswept rock was missing. One small, mundane biological factor was entirely absent from this ecosystem, and its absence alone rewrote the rules of survival for 4 decades. The story begins in 1810, when a sealing master out of Sydney charted the island, naming it after his merchant employers. By the late 1890s, colonial authorities opened the territory to pastoral leases, letting ambitious graziers try their luck. Stockmen shipped down timber, iron, and hundreds of breeding stock to carve out a run. When early attempts failed, syndicates doubled down, landing thousands of prime Merinos. The Merino is the most artificial creature humanity ever engineered. Centuries of relentless selective breeding forged an animal of extreme fleece density, bred with deep skin folds to pack on maximum wool. It is a biological factory designed to grow fleece continuously, without shedding, relying entirely on human shears to survive. Dumping Merinos onto an unforgiving, rain-lashed sub-Antarctic outpost was an ecological death sentence in slow motion. Yet at first, the stock thrived on lush, ancient megaherbs with massive leaves and purple blooms that had evolved without grazing pressure. By 1913, numbers surged past 7,000. But introduced herbivores inevitably strip finite island ecosystems bare. Within a decade, the hills were chewed to raw peat, the profits collapsed, and in 1931 the station was abandoned, stranding 4,000 sheep to rot. When the pastoral lease collapsed during the grip of the Great Depression, the abandonment was absolute. The station hands were left stranded on the outpost for 2 brutal years without a supply boat, shearing the flock simply because routine was all that kept them sane in that bleak landscape. When a relief vessel finally docked to haul them back to the mainland, the 2 seasons of greasy wool they brought aboard barely fetched enough at auction to cover the price of coal for the voyage. The station was abandoned, the lease dissolved, and 4,000 sheep were left to face the sub-Antarctic winter on a rock spanning just 11,000 hectares. To grasp the sheer scale of the inevitable slaughter, you have to understand the biological fragility of the modern flock. Ancestral wild mouflons, hunted across prehistoric ranges 10,000 years ago, possessed a natural shedding cycle, casting their dense winter coats every spring. Selective breeding wiped that survival trait out entirely to maximize commercial fleece production. An unshorn wool breed left in the open accumulates dead weight at a terrifying rate. On the mainland, whenever a rogue straggler evades muster in the scrub of the Great Dividing Range, the results are grotesque. Massive, blinding heaps of sodden wool topping 35 kilograms, burdening an animal half that size until its joints buckle. Beyond the crippling weight lies the far more lethal danger of getting cast. If a top-heavy sheep loses its footing on a steep, rain-soaked tussock slope and rolls onto its spine, it cannot right itself. The fermenting gut continues generating gas, swelling the rumen until it crushes the lungs against the rib cage, suffocating the beast in agony within a few hours. On an island carved by jagged ravines, scree, and saturated peat bogs, every rest was a lethal gamble. Yet the real executioner of unmanaged stock across our home pastures was completely missing here. The defining curse of every paddock from the Riverina to the Western Australian wheat belt is fly strike. When warm drizzle soaks the crutch and deep skin folds of a heavy fleece, the moisture festers, and blowflies strike within hours, laying thousands of eggs that hatch into maggots to devour the animal alive from the skin inward. In ordinary station country, an unshorn fleece is a gruesome death sentence executed inside a month. But out on this frozen southern outpost, relentless gales scream across the ranges day and night, stripping the air clean. The blowfly could never establish a foothold in winds that never drop. The deadly insect parasite was absent. The sheep had no shearers, no mineral licks, and no drenching, but they were granted this single vital reprieve from the scourge of fly strike. Without blowflies to decimate them, the flock faced an unyielding crucible of natural selection. By 1958, when government wildlife surveyors finally set foot on the territory to conduct the first formal census in nearly 3 decades, the population had dropped from 4,000 down to just under 1,000 head. 3/4 of the original stock had perished in the southern cold. Yet the collapse had halted, and against all odds, the numbers were climbing again without a shred of human management. What took place in that isolation was a brutal evolutionary bottleneck. Over 44 years, roughly 15 to 20 generations, nature stripped away every artificial trait bred into the stock over centuries. The heaviest, over-fleeced animals died early, cast on the steep, scrubby ridges or trapped in sodden peat. The survivors were those rare individuals carrying genetic throwbacks, lighter wool, longer legs, and harder constitutions. Left to breed exclusively among themselves, their offspring underwent a radical transformation. As the herd shrank, the battered native vegetation found room to regenerate, offering the surviving vanguard richer fodder than their predecessors had seen in decades. When field biologists returned in 1975, the creatures navigating the ridgelines were barely recognizable. They carried their heads high with the keen, wary posture of wild game scanning for predators. Their fleeces had grown thin, rugged, and weathered, and some had even begun shedding their wool naturally every season, a primitive trait known as ruing that centuries of selective breeding had sought to erase. Their jaws had physically restructured to tear through coarse, fibrous tussock. Even their reproductive biology had reverted to ancestral patterns. Ewes gave birth standing up, and lambs were on their feet and galloping within minutes of hitting the frozen turf. They had developed complete immunity to virulent foot rot in ground that remained permanently waterlogged, grazing 19 hours a day against howling gales. But this remarkable evolutionary milestone collided with a ruthless conservation reality. The island had been gazetted as a strict wildlife sanctuary to protect one of the planet's rarest oceanic treasures, the southern royal albatross, which nested in the tussock the sheep were steadily degrading. Land managers and conservation authorities faced a fierce mandate to eradicate the feral grazers entirely. In 1970, a controversial dividing fence was run straight across the island's spine. Every sheep north of the wire, some 1,300 head, was systematically shot by culling teams, leaving a pristine scientific contrast visible from the air, while the southern flock remained marked for ultimate extermination. The construction of that wire fence across the jagged ranges sparked an intense debate among scientists, pastoralists, and conservation officers. In our environmental history, introduced hoofed stock are rightly seen as catastrophic pests, hard-hooved invaders that churn topsoil, smash fragile riverbanks, and strip unique native flora down to the dirt. The mandate from wildlife authorities was clear: protect the vulnerable nesting grounds of the majestic southern royal albatross at all costs. Yet for agricultural geneticists and field biologists, the creatures south of the fence were no longer simple station stragglers. They were a living, breathing marvel of de-domestication, an unintentional, real-time experiment in evolutionary reversal that could never be recreated in a laboratory. Tension mounted between the pragmatic necessity of feral pest eradication and the desire to preserve a world-first biological wonder. When the culling marksmen pushed through the northern sector with high-powered rifles, clearing 1,300 animals from the slopes, the environmental recovery on that side of the wire was immediate. Megaherbs pushed back through the peat, and the ground-nesting seabirds reclaimed their open hollows. But to the south, the feral flock kept thriving, swelling toward 2,500 head, as if mocking the impending cull. Those tasked with planning the final eradication knew that pulling the trigger on the remaining herd meant wiping out a genetic lineage that possessed natural resistance to crippling foot rot, an instinct to shed coarse fleece, and an unmatched ability to survive on freezing coastal margins without human aid. The decision was made to mount a high-stakes salvage operation in 1975, before the total cull wiped the slate clean. But capturing feral stock that had lived wild for half a century was nothing like a standard paddock muster. Working dogs, usually the backbone of any stock operation from the outback stations to the southern highlands, were completely useless. The scent and bark of a dog simply drove the wary animals over sheer sea cliffs into the roaring swell below. Instead, a determined ground crew of 10 men had to go in on foot, armed only with stock whips and tin whistles, traversing deep, treacherous peat bogs and razor-sharp scree and blinding squalls. When cornered against the fence line, massive feral rams turned and charged the men with savage, wild aggression, refusing to submit to the human presence that had abandoned them 44 years before. The ground team fought their way across the subantarctic ranges, eventually corralling 58 prime feral specimens against the perimeter. From that muster, they selected 10 of the absolute hardiest animals to preserve the genetic legacy for mainland agricultural science. But securing wild beasts in this unforgiving wilderness proved perilous. In a desperate attempt to keep the chosen 10 restrained while managing the rest, the crew tethered them along the fence line with heavy collars. It was nearly a catastrophic mistake. Within minutes of the handlers stepping back, predatory brown skuas, fierce, opportunistic raptors of the Southern Ocean, swept in on the tethered animals, forcing the men to sprint back through the driving sleet to beat the birds off with wooden staves. From there began an excruciating overland haul. With no vehicular tracks and ground that would swallow a quad bike whole, each struggling 70-kilogram feral ram had to be hoisted directly onto a man's shoulders. The handlers trudged 2 grueling kilometers over wind-blasted ridges, slick peat bogs, and jagged basalt slopes down to the waiting longboats. Every step into the roaring Antarctic gale required absolute grit. Drop an animal in that rough terrain, and you would never get it back onto your shoulders alone. Just before Christmas in 1975, those 10 priceless survivors were loaded aboard the vessel and shipped north to establish a secure research flock. What followed on the island was the inevitable clinical conclusion demanded by environmental stewardship. By the late 1980s, state conservation shooters moved systematically through the southern ridges, executing the final eradication cull of roughly 3,000 remaining head. For the marksmen, eliminating an animal that had demonstrated such astonishing evolutionary tenacity was grim business. But the ecological response that followed was an awe-inspiring masterclass in natural resilience. With grazing pressure completely removed for the first time in nearly a century, the island underwent an explosive ecological rebound. The ancient megaherbs surged across the valleys, unfurling dinner plate-sized foliage and brilliant yellow and purple floral spikes that hadn't blanketed the hills since the 19th century. Thick maritime tussock re-anchored the fragile peat soils, arresting decades of erosion. And across the open expanses, the southern royal albatrosses reclaimed their ancestral nesting territories in undisturbed thousands, wheeling through the southern skies above an island finally returned to its primeval state. The 10 rescued animals were kept as a strictly isolated, purebred research flock, offering agricultural researchers a priceless window into biological endurance. Here was living proof that even the most thoroughly engineered domestic breed could rapidly shed human-imposed traits when pushed to the absolute brink of survival. Yet tragedy struck that bloodline decades later in 2017. Intruders breached the remote paddock where the flock was housed, brutally poaching several prime ewes that were within a fortnight of lambing. The surviving stock dwindled to just 30 individuals, a bitter blow considering the meat of a rugged, wild-running wool lineage is practically unpalatable. The incident underscored the sheer fragility of these rare genetic relics once outside their wild context. To envision what the southern island flock might have become had nature been granted another 1,000 years, we only have to look across the globe to the ancient, primitive feral breeds that have roamed remote maritime islands for millennia. Such creatures have completely shed the heavy, cumbersome fleece of agriculture, transforming into nimble, dark-coated, fine-boned wild ruminants that drop their coats naturally every spring with no human assistance. The forgotten flock on that subantarctic rock had covered an astonishing amount of that evolutionary distance in a mere 44 years. Left to run on their own for a few more centuries, the animals roaming those ridges would have evolved into an entirely distinct wild species, completely detached from any domestic stock ever driven through a shearing shed. Yet our stewardship of the land demands hard, pragmatic choices. In our unforgiving landscapes, where delicate ecosystems evolved in isolation for millions of years, an introduced ungulate cannot coexist with ancient, slow-breeding native wildlife. We made the necessary intervention. We culled the feral herd to ensure the island's magnificent albatross colonies and ancient flora could reclaim their rightful territory, preserving 10 individuals to remember what natural selection is capable of when human intervention vanishes. Nature does not pine for human design. Given the chance, it dismantles our artificial breeding and reclaims its wild sovereignty with ruthless efficiency. There are countless remarkable ecological histories buried across our remote territories and southern frontiers, waiting to be brought to light. If you want to uncover more of these untold stories of wild survival and landscape evolution, make sure to follow along and subscribe for the next chapter.